Welcome to Leadership Unlocked, where we don't just talk about leadership, we try to get under the hood and figure out what actually works. I'm Dusty Holcomb, and around here, we believe that the best leadership lessons come from the field, not the textbook. Moments that tested you and decisions that changed you. Wins, losses, and everything in between. In these solo episodes, I share the real stories that shaped how I lead and the tools that came out of them. One challenge, one turning point, one thing that you can use right now. Let's get into it. This is Leadership Unlocked. The best leadership advice I ever got: be interested, not interesting. We've all been in conversations where one person dominates the air and we tune out. What if I told you that the best leadership advice I've ever received came down to this: spend more time being interested than being interesting? You know, one of the challenges is that many leaders equate impact with presence, speaking more, impressing more, filling the air. We often talk about and joke about the hippo problem that I mentioned previously, the highest paid person's opinion. That's what happens in leadership. Many people equate airtime to impact. But in doing so, what we miss is that we have a superpower right at the tip of our fingers, and it's curiosity. Insecure leaders perform. Secure leaders inquire. And I think that's really important. When you have insecurity, you have to be heard. When you have security, you need to understand. You need to learn. When we try to lead with answers, we kill innovation. But when we lead with questions, we can unlock growth. All right, so my story, my journey towards curiosity began in a really different and maybe a bit unique way. You see, from fifth grade forward until college, I was homeschooled. Not in the way that it's done today, where there's a lot of structure and there's a lot of programs. In fact, there's a lot of groups where people can participate together when they homeschool their kids. Back when I was going through this in the early 80s, it was different. It was ahead of its time, frankly. And I remember seeing the grade reports and the worksheets that my mom sent in, and they were very formulaic and very, boxes were checked. And I remember thinking to myself, but wait a minute, we didn't actually do all those things. You see, because my learning was really about what I was interested in. And I think that's the root of my personal curiosity, is from the fifth grade until, the completion of high school, anything I wanted to learn, I could, and I got to it through reading. So I became very, very curious. That's how I fueled my intellectual growth. Homeschooling was unstructured. It was very autodidactic. I could learn whatever it is that I wanted to read. And that's what I did, specifically history, study of leaders, study of World War II history was a passion of mine. And it developed this deep self-led curiosity. Those learning habits have really driven me to become a curious learner, because I don't know anything. I really just am trying to understand how the world works. And that started at age 10 in the fifth grade. That thread really carried through into my career. I've always pursued learning. I've always pursued knowledge, and it has bled over into the teams that I've led. One of the things that we used to do when I was at AAA, this is, 15 or 20 years ago, and it bled over into my leadership career, bled over into how I lead others. I've always sought out learning and knowledge and classes, and I would bring the best of those, the ones that I really liked, the ones that resonated with me, into our team environments, into our organization. And it was maybe 15, maybe 17 years ago now, when I was at AAA, there was a group at that time. It was the John Maxwell Leader Cast. It's changed names a few times. In fact, I don't even know if it's still going on today in that form. But back then, it was the John Maxwell Leader Cast. It was back in the day where they would actually send out DVDs at one point. And then we got to this live virtual simulcast. And the technology, this is, again, 15, almost 20 years ago. And I remember sitting at the back of the room, looking around and being blown away by how, as the different speakers came on stage and delivered their presentation, people were leaned in. They were learning. They were taking notes. I was as well. In fact, I'll fully admit that this was really about an opportunity for me to learn and to share that, because that was our leadership culture. That was what we were trying to do, is to create better leaders. We knew that in order for us to deliver the business results we wanted, we needed to build the leaders that could do it. But I remember sitting there getting ready to watch Jim Collins come on stage. And I was excited because I was a huge Jim Collins fan. His book, Good to Great, had come out just a year or two before. And his ability to not only deliver a great presentation, but also to decode what was complicated information into something really tangible and digestible was second to none. I loved it. And his ability to simplify has inspired me many times over the years. And then he unpacked what it was that shifted him from being someone who was very good at understanding problems to someone that was very curious about why problems existed. And that was the best leadership advice I would get. I didn't know it at the moment he said it. He shared the story about meeting and working with Peter Drucker. And he was excited. He was a young management consultant just out of grad school. And he had an opportunity to work with Peter Drucker, the guru of management, the guru of strategy. Now, Peter Drucker has written countless books, and he is the father of the modern management. His book, The Effective Executive, frankly, is as good today as it was when it was written in the late 60s. Jim tells the story, and this is his story, but it really resonated with me. The reason it resonated was because as he told the story, he recognized and realized that he was showing off. And he asked Peter at the end of a week of work, at the end of a week of engagement, Peter, Mr. Drucker, what is it that I could do to become more effective and impactful as I leave here from this session? And to hear him tell it, Peter sat back and thought for a moment and then looked at him and said, well, Mr. Collins, you will find that you will get a lot more done and have a lot more impact if you spend more time being interested and less time being interesting. When you think about that reframe, how we as humans want to tell, we want to show, we want to demonstrate how much we've learned, how much we know, just how good we are. And what Peter was telling him was that other people are far more interested in being heard than they are in hearing. And you will create more opportunity for impact and influence if you focus on being interested in them and focus less on being the one who is most interesting. I remember sitting back in my chair and feeling somewhat self-indicted, somewhat called out, because I'll admit that while I was curious and while I was interested in learning, I like to be heard. And I had kicked off that morning's session and said all the right things, but I know that in the meetings, the questions to statement ratio wasn't very strong. In fact, that was this specific advice that Peter then led with, which was change your questions to statements ratio. How do you ask the right questions? That changed everything for me and reinforced that it was okay to be curious, and curiosity is not a weakness. And it changed how I lead. It changed how I spend my time and where I put my effort, which is into creating questions. I mean, think about it. When we meet somebody for coffee or we go to a cocktail party, the conversation is masquerading in many cases as connection because we are listening to respond. What if we're listening to learn? We're listening to understand. We are listening to connect. We don't say what I have to say is more important, but that's exactly what we communicate when we overtalk and under listen. I think it comes down to this. And I thought a lot about this over the years, and it's really given me some fuel for thinking and fuel for growth, is that when we communicate curiosity through the quality of our questions, through the ability to sit back and listen and chew on what it is that someone's talking to us about. The risk that we have to overcome, that mental hurdle inside, is that curiosity is weakness, that we may not know all the answers. And I think that that's a common pitfall for leaders as they grow up in their careers, as they become more impactful. I think it's a fallacy, but it can be a common fallacy. Curiosity isn't weakness. It's leadership fuel. It's impact fuel. Asking questions doesn't diminish your authority. It builds trust. It builds respect, and it builds followership. One of my most favorite books of late has been The Coaching Habit. I've given this to clients. I've read it multiple times myself, and it's got 7 questions that change conversations. And it really puts a bow around this entire premise about this leadership advice that I received. Spend more time being interested and less time being interesting. Humility is aspirational. In fact, there's the old joke that, hey, as soon as you say you're humble, you're not. It's the ability to lean into the sting of not knowing or of being wrong. And that's what builds enduring leaders. When we have the humility to admit, I don't know, but I want to learn. That's where impact is unlocked. That's where influence is unlocked. Greatness begins with humility and the ambition for something greater than yourself. Single best advice I ever received. I've been amazed over the years at how many times the ability to stop and ask a question has led to a greater insight. It has led to a greater impact. I think showing up and understanding that you're not the smartest person in the room, you don't have all the answers, but by asking the right questions, you can get to the right place has been a game changer. And there's some great ways to do this. Like you can do it in a leadership team meeting and saying, hey, what's one thing that we're not seeing right now? Or my favorite question, which is, what is it that I am missing? Now, I'll be really specific there. It's not about what are we missing. I'm not trying to dilute that and say, we as a leadership team aren't doing a great job. I am very intentional about saying, what is it that I might be missing? What am I missing? Because saying it that way communicates, I don't know all the answers. I don't need to know all the answers because I know that as a team, we will. We can ask better questions. We might know the answer. From a leadership perspective, that single Jim Collins speech almost 20 years ago shifted how I think about showing up for others. It isn't my job to have all the answers. It's not my job to know where it is we're going. It's my job to articulate the best questions that allow us as a team, that allow those we serve to lean in. Listening is a superpower. Curiosity is a superpower. Neither one of those things are weakness. In fact, they're exactly the opposite. They are what unlocks greatness in others. I'll admit that over the years, I've failed. In fact, I've failed in this recently, I know, because it's human nature to be heard. It's human nature to lean in. And I wish I could have a magic circuit breaker that would allow me to stop when I need to speak and instead when I should ask a question. But it is the desire to be better and the opportunity to grow that keeps me coming back. The most effective leaders I know, they don't dominate the room. They light it up with curiosity. Be interested, not interesting. That's the shift that changes everything. Here's something you can think about. When was the last time you intentionally asked more questions than you answered? I'd encourage you to send this episode to someone who shows up curious. Let them know it's a leadership strength. In fact, that's a slight soapbox moment here. Make sure that you tell people that they're doing the right thing. If you appreciate something about someone, tell them. Because if you don't, they'll never know. And maybe they'll stop. Reinforce great behavior. Call it out. If today's episode gave you something to think about, something to apply, head over to leadershipunlockedpodcast.com or visit arcusgroup.com and join the newsletter. It's where we share tools, insights, and our leadership frameworks to help you lead with more clarity, more alignment, and more impact. No fluff, just what helps you lead better. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time on Leadership Unlocked.